I think the BAFTA Fellowship is probably the best birthday present I could have ever thought of outside what I got from my family. And I was really blown away. I had no idea. It was a great surprise. And to be honest, quite emotional, because I've been in this industry for a good length of time, and it's wonderful to be recognised by your peers.
You said you've been asked before to be on Strictly Come Dancing.
Several times. I was asked to be in the very first Strictly. I couldn't, because I was actually making a series for the BBC in the new accession states of the European Union. And I've been asked 2 or 3 times in the intervening period, and I think the answer will always be no.
What about the traitors? Would you do the traitors?
I'm game for a lot of things. I've done, Celebrity MasterChef, I've done Celebrity Bake Off. I'm game for things. I love craft. I like making things. So I would be game for most things, just not physically difficult. For the interview with Margaret Thatcher, we did a great deal of brainstorming, and that actually is one of my favourite things to do before an interview, even now, is to sit down with a group of really smart people and just game the interview, structure it, think about it. But I had the added issue for the Margaret Thatcher interview, 2 added issues. One, she tried to stop me doing it because I was a woman. And second, that only my husband and I knew I was pregnant, and I was determined, with my first child, and I was determined that I was not going to get, as we call it, het up beforehand. I wasn't going to do anything to jeopardise the birth of what turned out to be my baby girl. A week or so before the interview, she was coming to Scotland because she couldn't work out why people in Scotland were actually adopting some of her policies, like buying their council houses, but still didn't vote for her. So she was on a charm offensive, which is a contradiction in terms. Downing Street clocked, finally, about a week before the interview, that I was going to be the interviewer. And she didn't want to be interviewed by a woman, and she didn't want to be interviewed by me particularly. And Downing Street tried to stop it. She'd only been interviewed by Miriam Stoppard, who was a kind of clinical, a doctor, and a woman on a phone-in who asked her repeatedly about the sinking of the Belgrano. Otherwise, she'd only been interviewed by men. So yes, she tried to stop me interviewing her, but the BBC stuck to its guns and said, if you're not interviewed by Kirsty, you won't be interviewed by anybody. And that was a great day for the BBC, I think.
Margaret Thatcher said herself that you interrupted her more than she's ever been interrupted. How does it feel to have such huge historical figures have such opinions?
Margaret Thatcher didn't like being interrupted, and maybe I interrupted in some interviews too much, but I was very judicious in this interview. But I knew I also only had half an hour with her, so there's certain things I had to get to, and I didn't want to be distracted. But I think she came at me after the interview simply because she was upset that I was doing the interview in the first place. I don't think interrupting interviews is key. What I think is that you have to listen very, very carefully, and at the point where it's not a productive interview on either side, then you have to step in. Though, the technique would certainly be that it's probably not best to interrupt someone on their first answer. But politicians, past, present, and indeed I'm sure future, have their own techniques. So I remember interviewing Tony Benn, and Tony Benn would say at the start of an answer, "Now, Kirsty, there are 3 points to this answer," so that you wouldn't interrupt him till he got to the end of the 3rd point, which could be a very long time. I think that I dealt with nerves by being uber prepared. So I always did my homework. And I always found that people that were comfortable in their own skin were lovely. And the people that were maybe a bit nippy were people that were insecure themselves or had a degree of arrogance which came across on television, which was not to their advantage. I've done so many interviews which I reflect on from different ways. I did an interview with Bridget Riley about her work, which was really important. I interviewed Toni Morrison about her incredible writing. I've interviewed many politicians, but the political interviews, Thatcher was one thing, but other political interviews, I suppose what happens is they are now feel more in the past than some of the big cultural interviews I've done, where I feel that they still stand as part of that artist or that writer's oeuvre. So yes, I would say people like Harold Pinter, people like Toni Morrison, people like Philip Roth, people like Joan Didion. Those interviews I absolutely love doing and would do them again. There are tough questions and there are tough questions. I think when you are in a situation where there has been a great tragedy, terrible tragedy, then the way you couch your question, you don't want to be prurient, but if it's relevant to the audience to hear the detail, you need to get to that detail. So I think I would say at times of tragedy, that's when you have to be on your mettle. So I won't say this particular question, but I think there are circumstances in which it is very tough to ask the questions you want to ask. And what you have to do is develop a technique to be able to do that without sounding both prurient and mawkish and intrusive. I think the thing about Newsnight is it's a serious programme, but we don't take ourselves too seriously. And God Save the Queen and Thriller were just a bit of fun at the end of the programme. And you can only do that if you've delivered a good programme. And Newsnight generally delivered a good programme. If you don't deliver a good programme, you haven't earned the right to be, supposedly witty or irreverent. But if you've done your homework, you've done the programme well, then a bit of irreverence harms nobody. I think distance lends perspective, and so actually now I would really like to interview Barack Obama, to be honest. I think at this stage that's who we really want to hear from. And hear about not necessarily what's happening now, but what happened when he was president as well, the things that went right and the things that went wrong. I remember being at the Democrat convention in Boston, where for the first time Barack Obama took the stage, and listening to what was a brilliantly crafted speech and thinking then, this man is going to be president of the United States, and that was a spine-tingling moment.